This is how I made my first dollar welding. This all started when a buddy approached me at work asking me to do some welding. He's got a side hobby where he's designing a control unit to control water temperature, whether it be in a tank or a reservoir. Now, I don't know nothing about that, but I do know the housing that he's using was made out of 14 gauge steel. So the first thing I wanted to do was make sure I knew how to weld at this thickness. So I went ahead and pulled up my new MIG 215 and I pulled up some scrap metal that I had as close to the 14 gauge. I had 1/8 and I had 16 gauge. So what I did was run a few beads with the suggested settings on my welder. Now, both of those suggested settings were on the money. And so what I elected to do was take that 14 gauge steel and use the suggested machine settings. Let's do some welding. So I got into welding these corners and there was a massive gap. It was a hair more than 1/8 of an inch gap, which is a lot since they are only 14 gauge. So I started out tacking this side of each of these corners to try to reduce how much it's gonna deflect as you go along. Now, as I started to get into welding these, I figured out that gap was just way too big and I started burning through or burning out the two sides of the steel. First thing I did was turn my welder, the heat, the amperage. So I went from, I believe it was a suggested 3 on the dial here, to about a 2.5 or just a hair over 2. And that helped out quite a bit, but I was still having trouble kind of punching through that big root gap. Then I went to a technique of tack welding. So I would start my weld, do a little bit of a circle, get a good puddle going there on each side of the plates on that open corner, and then I'd stop, I'd let it cool down so I didn't burn through it, and then I would start again. So I did that all the way across that corner, and it seemed to work quite well. There were a few times where my wire would stick through that wide gap and lose arc, and it made it look pretty crappy on the inside. I went through each of those corners and tack welded them out, and you can see they look decent. Like I would not hesitate to provide this unit without grinding with how these welds look. Now, my buddy asked for the corners to be ground and looking nice and smooth. So I went ahead and spent the time to do the grinding. The first thing I did was grind the outside and make those corners rounded. I tried to make them consistent, but I was only using a 4.5 inch angle grinder to do this. So there's a little bit of variability between corner to corner, but for the most part, they looked pretty consistent. This portion of it took about 10-15 minutes, but it was well worth it and it looked beautiful from the outside. Now, after I got that done, I let it sit overnight and it ended up developing some rust in a few areas. So what I elected to do was use a surface conditioner, which you can see here. I got it from Harbor Freight. Now, this was actually the first time I used it, and it was a little bit big and bulky for this application. I wouldn't necessarily suggest it. I think the strong point for this surface conditioner is probably cleaning a large surface area, but it did work for this project here. So I went through and I cleaned up all that rust using that, as well as a little sanding square. On the inside, it looked like crap. I pulled all those little wires out and I took a burr grinder, which you can see here, with a rounded bit, and I tried to clean those corners up on the inside. It didn't look great, but I got it done. I was not gonna spend additional time to make it look perfect, since it was gonna be on the inside of the unit and you really can't see it. So at that point, I really decided to call it quits. It looked like a nice unit, everything looked clean, and I took it back to the owner at work. So in that process, I did go ahead and log all my time or keep track of it so I could break it down and make an estimate for all future units that he wants me to weld. If he wants me to weld it. It may not be that good. Now, overall, this was a pretty good experience. I enjoyed welding and trying out something new, and I enjoyed trying to figure out how much time and what I would charge in the future. I got to help out a friend. I think he was happy with the product. He said he was. So we'll see if he really was. And I would highly suggest that if you're wanting to get into welding, try this out. Try out a few projects, put yourself out there, let people know that you like to weld, that you could be a good fit for whatever welding needs somebody might have, and then just go and try it. So I hope this was helpful. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Please like and subscribe. Peace.